On the windswept Grand Banks and along the jagged coastlines of Newfoundland and Labrador, Atlantic cod, Gadus morhua, were for centuries the economic and cultural backbone of communities from St. John's to Bonavista. They sustained salt cod exports to Europe and the Caribbean and filled household larders in outport villages. By the 20th century, that sepia-toned subsistence fishery had been transformed. Diesel trawlers, hydraulic winches, factory ship processing, and echo sounder technology turned small skiffs into part of an industrial armada capable of unprecedented catch rates. The 1977 proclamation extending Canada's fisheries jurisdiction to 200 nautical miles opened the Grand Banks to domestic fleet expansion, triggering a rapid buildup of offshore otter trawlers and stern trawlers. At the same time, Department of Fisheries and Oceans scientific surveys and catch reports in the 1980s began registering falling catch per unit effort, CPUE, and shrinking age classes. Soviet distant water fleets in the 1960s and 1970s had already demonstrated the destructive capacity of modern gear, and rising capital investment created a growing mismatch between fleet capacity and conservative management. Fishermen's livelihoods, local fish plants in ports such as St. John's and Porto Basque, and household diets were all tied to a fishery showing clear early warning signals: plummeting catches, increasing juvenile scarcity, and contentious quota debates. Those warning signs would soon set the stage for an acute crisis. Through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the industrial armada grew bolder. Larger stern trawlers, factory freezer vessels, and stern haul otter trawlers prowled the Grand Banks and Flemish Cap, sweeping year classes from the sea with hydraulic winches and stern ramps that processed fish at sea. Department of Fisheries and Oceans trawl surveys aboard CCGS Hudson and coastal research vessels began to register what scientists called truncated age structures, collapsing spawning biomass, and falling catch per unit effort. Yet annual landings reported in DFO statistics remained deceptively large because factory processing and at-sea freezing hid discard practices and uneven reporting. Maybe clicking subscribe would have saved the cod. Total allowable catches and individual quotas, the linchpins of management, were calibrated to those flawed statistics and to industry submissions, creating a perilous lag between reality and regulation. In harbors from St. John's to Fortune, plant managers and fishery unions pushed back against proposed cuts, citing jobs at established shore plants and offshore processing contracts. Industry lobbyists in Ottawa pressed for stability rather than sharp reductions. DFO scientists, backed by academic assessments, increasingly warned of imminent stock collapse in internal memos and at scientific advisory meetings, presenting autumn survey time series that showed the near disappearance of multi-year mature cod on the southern and eastern Grand Banks. That warning drumbeat collided with a political calculus. Federal politicians were wary of shutting down a cornerstone of Newfoundland and Labrador's economy, and communities already reeling from decades of mechanized change resisted immediate sacrifice. When John Crosbie took responsibility as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans in 1991, he inherited this combustible split between science and vested economic interest, and the gap between evidence and policy widened, propelling events toward the inevitable rupture to come. By 1991 and into spring 1992, trawl surveys by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans aboard the CCGS Hudson and coastal research vessels produced an unambiguous Gilded-era ledger of decline. Survey indices showed collapsing recruitment and precipitous falls in catch per unit of effort on the southern and eastern Grand Banks and the Flemish Cap. Scientists at DFO and Memorial University brought time series to advisory meetings that documented shrinking age classes and the near absence of multi-year spawners that had once sustained regular yields. In harbor towns from St. John's to Bonavista and Porto Basque, people felt those numbers in real time. Plant supervisors cut shifts, freezer processor contracts were renegotiated, and the Fish, Food, and Allied Workers Union logged mounting layoff notices. Wharves emptied and household anxiety grew. Public meetings turned sharp as competing explanations crowded the room. Some captains and harvester associations blamed harp seals and gray seals for voracious predation. Other analysts pointed to climate variability, citing shifts in sea temperature and the North Atlantic Oscillation as factors that could affect larval survival. Skeptical voices warned that discards, at-sea processing, and poor reporting had created dangerous uncertainties in the data. Ottawa became the stage for the argument. Minister John Crosbie and officials in the Mulroney government convened technical briefings, industry roundtables, and stakeholder consultations through spring and early summer 1992, while provincial leaders in Newfoundland and Labrador pressed for job protections. Each new report deepened the rift between precautionary science and economic urgency, and every political delay widened the gap between what the surveys demanded and what communities could afford to lose, setting the stage for a fateful, unavoidable reckoning. Late June 1992 brought a brassy, salt-sprayed crescendo. Internal Department of Fisheries and Oceans reports and Atlantic trawl survey projections combined into a stark alarm. DFO scientists, drawing on data from CCGS Hudson cruises and coastal trawl indices, showed spawning biomass on the southern and eastern Grand Banks reduced to a fraction of its mid-century abundance, with recruitment projected to remain perilously low without drastic intervention. Those stark stock projections landed on Minister John Crosbie's desk in Ottawa as he balanced cabinet briefings in Rideau Hall with urgent dispatches from St. John's. Emergency deliberations unfolded in cramped briefing rooms and at telephone tables. DFO biologists warned that continued directed fishing would guarantee biological collapse. Industry representatives and plant managers from Porto Basque, Fortune, and Bonavista answered that months of shutdown would bankrupt shore plants, void freezer processor contracts, and strand tens of thousands of fishers and plant workers across hundreds of coastal communities. The Fish, Food, and Allied Workers Union pressed for transitional safeguards. Industry lobbyists demanded phased cuts in compensation. Provincial leaders warned of cascading social ruin in Newfoundland and Labrador. Each meeting exposed a hard moral calculus: protect a collapsing stock for future generations or preserve livelihoods today. The debate was clinical and combustible, rooted in incontrovertible data, yet haunted by human cost. As DFO modelers produced worst-case scenarios and the media showed empty wharves and laid-off crews, the calendar moved toward July, and a single unavoidable decision loomed, one that would force ministers, scientists, and industry to choose between ecological preservation and immediate economic survival. On July 2, 1992, Minister of Fisheries and Oceans John Crosbie stood in Ottawa and announced a complete moratorium on directed fishing for northern cod, Gadus morhua, off Newfoundland and Labrador. The decision, based on CCGS Hudson surveys and Fisheries and Oceans Canada stock assessments showing the southern and eastern Grand Banks had collapsed, landed like a thunderclap. Within hours, the vessels that normally steamed the Grand Banks were tied up at idle wharves from St. John's to Porto Basque. Stern trawlers and small skiffs alike sat silent with nets coiled on deck. Plant gates closed, factory freezers went dark, contracts were suspended, and payrolls froze. Tens of thousands of fishers and plant workers faced sudden unemployment, a financial cliff that sent a shock through outport kitchens. The Fish, Food, and Allied Workers Union and community leaders called emergency meetings as people queued for employment counseling and welfare forms. The mood swung from disbelief to acute grief, salt-stung, Gilded-era livelihoods vanishing at the stroke of a ministerial pen, and the country was forced into a national reckoning over biological recovery and the social cost that would shape the long, arduous aftermath. On July 2, 1992, when John Crosbie announced the moratorium, the Atlantic Canadian food economy was remade. Coastal outports in Newfoundland and Labrador suffered plant closures and waves of migration to urban centers, while the fish processing industry contracted as capital shifted toward emerging snow crab and shrimp fleets and toward aquaculture. Governments responded with emergency income support, retraining and vessel buyback programs, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, DFO, instituted stricter stock assessment, monitoring and reporting protocols, along with a more precautionary management stance. The social fabric frayed, trust between fishers, scientists, and Ottawa became brittle, and communities endured demographic hollowing and cultural loss. Ecologically, cod biomass has not returned to its mid-20th century abundance, and recovery remains slow and uncertain. The moratorium stands as a stark cautionary tale about biological limits, governance failures, and the moral urgency of pairing science with social safeguards.